Well, it is a privilege for me to be here this evening, and thank you all for coming out and seeing this firsthand. Being able to ask questions and such, there's an advantage of being here. So we will get right into it. Just before the virus took control of our lives in one way or another, Kim and I completed research that we titled Advertising a Small Town. And we've got some books on the back table you're welcome to look at. And for a little bit more information and research later on, you can take a look at those books. So this is a study of Whitewater, Kansas from October 1885 to July 1979. But it is a glimpse of virtually every small town in mid-America. So what did this study entail? We researched every newspaper in microfilm, digital, and print format from Brainerd and Whitewater. And we collected advertisements and clippings which describe commerce, structure, and people of the town. So this presentation is a very small portion of the study. When we first started looking into this, Kim says, well, what do you expect? And I said, it could be a book of about 50 pages. What we published was nearly 600 pages of advertising. There is no truer history of a town or of an area than reading the ads. I know Russ here, sitting on the front. Him and I could each tell you stories about Whitewater, and you would have to take our word for it. Whereas when we see the ad in the newspaper, we know that there was a definite time that this started happening. So what got me interested in advertising in the first place? And why did I think it could be a valuable book? Decades ago already, I collected hammers, and I had a significant hammer collection. At the time that I sold the collection a number of years ago, I had around 650 hammers, and they were all different. We don't imagine that sort of thing, but I found that to be true. So part of the research in identifying hammers and so forth, I came across this ad in the Sears and Roebuck catalog of 1902. It says the following hammers are forged from the best cast steel and are warranted against flaws and not to be soft. They are not so highly finished and polished as the higher priced goods, but for common use, they give excellent satisfaction. Don't compare these hammers with cast iron goods. We tell you that cast iron hammers are no good, and you will find them so. We tell you that these hammers are all right, and you will not be disappointed if you buy one. Directly below that was this ad. Cast iron hammers are positively no good. We have a few of these hammers in stock, which we would rather keep than sell to our customers. If you must have them, we will sell you a light one for 8 cents and a full size for 10 cents. You will be sorry if you buy one. Can't you afford to buy a first-class hammer at our prices for them? See how cheap they are. I was sucked in. I was a believer in advertising, and what great ads. I wish we had more of these today rather than trying to pull the wool over our eyes. So the newspapers that we looked at, we start with the Brainerd Sun, and that was from October 1885 to September 1888. That was followed by the Brainerd Ensign, or sometimes just called the Ensign, from October of 88 to June of 1889. In June of 1889 was Whitewater's first newspaper. It was called the Tribune, or the Whitewater Tribune. You see two different editors here, Hendy and Bailey. And the Tribune ran through June 1893. That was followed by the Weekly Herald from June of 93 to September of 96. And then was the Independent. And some of you sitting in the room here tonight will remember the Independent. Sometimes called the Weekly Independent, sometimes the Whitewater Independent, but mostly it was the Independent. And that ran from 1896 to July of 1979. So what to watch for as we go through this presentation? Skills or services that were needed in the starting of a town. Products or supplies that were in demand. Evolution of business and infrastructure. And I'll point out a couple of those, how a business had to reinvent itself in order to keep up with changes over the years. And then dates of innovations and improvements, and some of which might surprise you. So Brainerd was incorporated in 1885. It was founded by a man named Elisha Brainerd. And some of the first ads that we see were from the Brainerd newspaper. And the reason is that the proprietors later show up in Whitewater. So here's the old Reliable. They sell queensware, groceries, glassware, etc. Apparently he had two stores, one in Plum Grove, which is a town that no longer exists, and one in Brainerd. But one thing that really threw me for a loop was that second line. I was amazed that at this time that they would advertise farmer sex change. I didn't think that happened until quite a few years later. And so then I had to reread it and realize that it's two words instead of three. It's the farmers exchange. G.W. Neal first established himself in Brainerd. This was in 1885, building materials and hardware. The Whitewater Bank of Brainerd, Kansas, owned by the McLean family. We've never found any explanation of why it was called the Whitewater Bank of Brainerd. So a little bit of geography. So the Missouri Pacific Railroad was established from east to west, from El Dorado to Newton and on to McPherson. And along the way, towns were established. So on the right side of your slide there, you see Potwin, and then Brainerd. Whitewater did not exist. Annalee was established, McLean, and on to Newton. So that was along the Missouri Pacific Railroad in 1885. In 1888, the Rock Island Railroad came south from Peabody, virtually straight down through where Elbing was established later. And down to the curve, right below where it says Rock Island Railroad. Initially, it was routed to go off to the southeast there and go through Brainerd, and then on towards Towanda. But seemingly, without too much warning, the direction of the railroad changed. It went to the southwest and across George Nyman's land, which is where the Rock Island intersected with the Missouri Pacific. A newspaper begins in Whitewater in June 1889. And one of the first things we see that the citizens of Brainerd have deserted the town and bolted for Whitewater, the new town in Butler County. Only a few of its citizens can be found among the number. The town of Brainerd is being abandoned by most of her progressive merchants. So said the Peabody Gazette. Brainerd was already unincorporated by this time. They did that in 1888. Apparently the city leadership saw the end coming, unincorporated the town. However, the post office was not closed until the end of August of 1907. A goodly number of Brainerd advertisements appear in this issue, but we are glad to say they will all be in Whitewater permanently very soon. So there's why we've started in Brainerd. The town of Brainerd literally moved to Whitewater. Some of the earliest advertising of Whitewater businesses included Carter, the carpenter and builder. Houses moved with promptness and care, which was an important service at this time. We also see McDowell has a barber shop in Whitewater, and Brune is the blacksmith and horseshoer. The little corner of Brainerd News in the Whitewater paper says 3 moving outfits are busy removing the bone and sinew of our town to Whitewater. So it was on the move. And then we hear from Annalee, which was Brainerd is 3 miles east of the Whitewater area, and Annalee was 3 miles west. It says about 7 o'clock Tuesday evening, the last building came in from Annalee. This was the little frame office of Mr. Burns, the grain dealer. Now, we don't believe that this was literally the last building from Annalee. It was the most recent building to be moved. There was some business that was maintained in Annalee, and the post office, you see, was not closed until actually the last day of 1921. So we've got Dr. Norris that shows up, Mr. Burns, whose office was just moved from Annalee. Wirt and Weatherby, contractors and builders, satisfaction guaranteed. They also do undertaking embalming as a specialty. And then Dr. Horner. So we had 2 surgeons or 2 doctors in town at this time. In July of 1889, this was the want list that the editor thought was appropriate: a tin shop, a cannery, an elevator, a shoemaker, a wagon maker, fewer chiggers, more residences, a public well, an established grade, miles of good sidewalks, more side tracks for her railroads, a public library, and reading room. A pretty impressive list. So the bank moved from Brainerd to Whitewater, and now is the Whitewater Bank of Whitewater. Seems to make more sense. Now, we've been talking about buildings being moved, literally. Not only did people just pack their suitcases and come 3 miles west from Brainerd, but they moved their buildings as well. There were primarily 3 ways that a building was moved. Smaller buildings, which there were a lot of, could be disassembled or taken apart, perhaps in 6 pieces, 4 walls and two ceiling or roof sections, laid on a wagon and hauled to Whitewater and reconstructed. Second way would be to put a building on a running gear as a complete building and towing that over that distance of 3 miles. The third way, which had to be used for some of the larger buildings that were moved, some of the heavier ones, was to use a stump puller and horses. So let me try to describe a stump puller to you. I don't mean to insult anyone's intelligence here, but it was a large, heavy winch. Very likely had 200, maybe 300 feet of cable on this winch. And it was built in a horizontal fashion so that the horses could walk around that spool and pull that and wind up the cable. So In order to make this work, you had to anchor that stump puller. So they buried anchors, or dead men, they called them. And in order to anchor the winch, and they would have that cable stretched out, fastened to the building, and they would drag it on skids, 200, 300 feet at a time. Once the building was up close, they had to reset, pull up their anchors, reset the dead men when they've moved that stump puller out, and start all over again with winding up the cable. A long, tedious process. It took days to move a building those 3 miles. Well, the Bank of Whitewater building was one that was moved that way. And so the farmers, when it was time to do business, they would just drive across the field and up to where the bank was that day and take care of their transaction. As far as we know, this is the first indication of mobile banking. Up until now, other than the bank, all the businesses were known by the proprietor. It was his name that was advertised. So this is the first ad that we find with the business name, the OK Boot and Shoe Shop, run by William Newberry. Mr. Weechman was a dealer in hardware, stoves, tinware, and farm implements, and coffins, caskets, and shrouds. At this time, there was no undertaker in Whitewater, but you could still buy the supplies necessary for a fine funeral. Raymond's Palace Drugstore was the place to go for your school books and supplies. Also carried a fine line of stationery and writing paper. The Whitewater Harness Shop was the first to use a street location. We don't know what street they were on, but we know they were between 3rd and 4th Street. As far as I know, there were only 2 choices going the other way, so it wouldn't have been too hard to find them. The city dray was one of the most important of services, hauling goods from the railroads, from the depots. There were 2 of them, remember, to the businesses and to residences, building materials, obviously coal, other supplies. So the dray was a very critical part of this young town. This is Mr. McDowell that we first met as a barber. He tried his hand at running a restaurant. And this was not at all uncommon. There were proprietors that tried easily a half a dozen different businesses over time to do whatever was necessary to supply something that was demanded of the new residents of this young town. And in order to get people's attention, he always printed his ad, or had his ad printed upside down. The Whitewater Town Company was very important at this time. When a new town was beginning to settle in and showed potential to be established, the town company was formed. They acted as the governance for the town, and as well as realtors and land agents. Whitewater was incorporated April 15, 1890. The brickyard is now in full blast. Thousands of bricks have been molded and are ready for the kiln. As Mr. Fessler came from Newton to Whitewater to establish a brick plant along the Whitewater River, just outside of town. And he claimed that this was superior quality clay that he found there at Whitewater. The barter system was extremely important to people at this time, and stores would advertise that they were willing to buy poultry, eggs, game, and various other farm products and animal produce. The Whitewater Bank, under the direction of the McLeans, ran into some difficulties, and George Nyman was appointed by the court to be executor and oversee taking care of any accounts with the bank. He eventually bought the bank, and it was renamed the Bank of Whitewater. And that remained in effect until just a very few years ago. Here's Mr. McDowell as a barber again. The one thing I wanted to point out was the artwork. This was something that we started seeing the previous year, 1890. Up until then, it was just word ads. We have on our shelves a full line of hats, caps, boots, and shoes, groceries, glassware, queensware. In fact, everything found in a goods store. This was the Penner Motor Store. The Penner store remained for several decades and at least 3 different generations. But through all this time of hardship and hard work and establishing a town and doing what was necessary to try to start a business, there was still time for celebration, and there's no better time than the 4th of July. And the Whitewater Band, which was a recognized organization, organized this celebration. There were orators, there were ball games, and cricket match, a basket dinner, an open air concert in the evening. In 1892, we were told that Mr. Spencer is building a neat porch in front of his hotel. And this photograph is from a few years later, from about 1910, but we can see what they were talking about. Violins, new and old. Culture was important to these early settlers. Mr. Jones advertising his barbershop, shaving and hairdressing, ladies' work done at residence if so desired. Little extra service. Here's Mr. Neal again, establishing himself in Whitewater as the lumber dealer and hardware. This was the first one of the earliest of the addresses. He used apparently used lot numbers to identify his location. Numbers 23, 24, 25, and 26 Main. John Eilert's had a general store. He was located at the corner of Main and Rock Island Streets. Rock Island was actually designated as 3rd Street, but for 2 blocks from the depot east to where the bank corner is now, was identified as Rock Island Street. In 1893, there's some talk of putting in a system of telephones in the city to connect the railroad depots with other points. That kind of technology may be a little bit earlier than what we might have imagined. Stationary engines for power of whatever reason was steam, required a boiler and engine repair shop, and Dean and Thomas had one in Whitewater. Kirkwood and Son Lumber and Hardware, and another business that went on for a lot of years. They're advertising here Deering's Harvesting Machinery. This was the first mention of national brand of farm equipment. Farm equipment had been advertised, but not with the brand name. And just as a sidelight, the Deering Harvester Company was founded in 1874. It merged with McCormick Harvesting in 1902 to become McCormick Deering, which later was International and Farmall Tractors. This is 1895 politics. We have the People's Ticket and the Citizens Ticket. Don't know what the difference was. No All Man that I am convinced beyond a doubt that the reports and stories that I have been circulating derogatory to the character of Frank A. White, as to certain actions unbecoming a gentleman of which said Frank A. White should have been guilty, are all in whole or in part absolutely false, slanderous, and libelous. And I believe said Frank A. White to be a Christian gentleman. This was signed by Mr. Penner and witnessed and satisfied the justice of the peace. Another practice that perhaps we should try to resurrect. Whitewater has 4 grocery stores and 3 more in prospect. This was in 1896. They ate a lot of groceries. This is one of them, the little 1-horse grocery on Upper Main Street, which probably means the north end of town. This was the last ad for the Whitewater Town Company. We already found out why they were established in the first place. Well, 7 years ago already, the town incorporated, establishing a city council and a mayor. We've seen a ballot for elections. So the town company continued under that name, but really just as a realtor or land agent, and had no authority as far as the governance of the town. We announced to the people of Whitewater and the vicinity that we have just opened up a general racket store. Generally, a racket is something we try to avoid. In this case, it was a general store known for low prices. It was derived from the peddler pushing his cart along the cobble streets, and you can imagine all the noise that the pots and pans bumping against each other, and his wares rattling as his cart rolled over the rough streets. And so they just named the store for that. It was a national store. First one opened in Nashville, North Carolina, 1887. Here's a late 1899 inventory of what was in Whitewater: 1 bank, 1 land company, 1 dry goods store, 3 grocery stores, 1 furniture, undertaking, and embalming. This was North Foss and Baker. North Foss came from Newton to Whitewater to help establish a undertaking service there. Baker came from Peabody. It's still the same. This was the same family that operates out of Peabody and Valley Center. I can't remember now if there's others. 1 general racket store, 1 hardware, 1 blacksmith. It says there C.B. Dean. Well, what happened to Brune? 1 harness maker, 1 carpenter firm, 2 doctors, 1 barber, 1 butcher, 1 drugstore, 2 candy stores. But then he goes on to say that there might be a better representation, but these enterprising representative firms are showing through the medium of the local organ that business is still being done at the old stand. In other words, these are the ones that put ads in the newspaper. Mr. Brune was there running his hardware store. Whitewater Milling and Elevator. This was something that started quite early in the history of Whitewater. 1899. Here's Mr. Neal again, but his ad says, have been too busy putting up windmills and pumps and selling hardware and harness to write an ad this week. There's need of more hitch racks on Main Street, as yet the ladies of Whitewater and the surrounding country do not have colored coachmen to hold their horse while they shop. We really have no reason to believe that this was a slur or anything racist, as we might imagine today. This is how it was. This is how they talked, and it was no doubt innocent enough. Just the idea that we needed more hitch racks in 1902. Ear trumpets have arrived at the racket, and all who have difficulty with their hearing should inspect them. An ear trumpet was what, a foot long or so that you held to your ear. Very discreet, I'm sure. Noticing the traffic in the city last Monday, it was suggested to us that we print a notice that the teams going north use one side of the road and the teams going south the other side, and that the fastest going processions keep each side of the middle of the road. We're talking 4 lanes of traffic through downtown Whitewater. That's pretty impressive, isn't it? The new phone cards printed in this office are printed in pica and can be read without magnifying glasses. Now, y'all are old enough to remember back to typing class, there were 2 different prints, pica, obviously, and what was the other one? Elite. Very good. I will note that on your review card. Here's the Eagle Restaurant. This is the first ad that we found with the use of a phone number, phone 17. $1,000 photograph postal cards at 5 cents each, available at the Huguenin Brothers. The Huguenin Brothers store, for those of you that are familiar a little bit with the layout of Whitewater, right across the street, south of the bank is an empty lot that's used for bank parking. That's where the Huguenin Brothers building was. On the back table, there's a 3-ring binder that has quite a number of postcards in it. And a lot of them have the same 1907, or a few of them have that 1907 postage cancellation stamp on them. You're welcome to take a look at that after the program as well. This is a 1907 ad for the Fred Brising meat market. It was known as the Brising Meat Market, generally called the City Meat Market. And this is his building, and Mr. Brising standing out in front. Now, just an extra word here. Kim Fields, who has been so helpful in research, is a great granddaughter of this Mr. Brising. So she definitely has an interest in what happened in town. This building was used for various things, including warehousing, and some may recall a library in this building. It was right beside Newman Hardware. And after it was no longer used as a library, there was some interest in this building because of its design. It was one of the last known for the construction. And I'm not familiar enough with architecture to explain that to you. Cowtown expressed an interest in it. The Brising family made it available to Cowtown and even worked to generate some funds for moving. So if you go to Cowtown today, this is what you would see. It's the same building. And the inside is very nicely done in the original setting that would have been in the late 1890s. The only thing is that Mr. Brising never used a vinyl banner across the front of his store. And I'm surprised that Cowtown does. Here's a washing machine that has no equal. It's got a long enough handle on it that it's easy to operate, easy to run. That's how the agitator was turned. It's available at Penner's store if you're interested. Mr. Brune is advertising farm machinery, implements, repairs, blacksmithing, horseshoeing, wagon and carriage work. etc. On the east side of South Main Street, same old stand, but new, well, it should be now, but now in the new brick building. Ask anybody where Bruns is, they all know him. Mr. Lamer has fitted up a neat bathroom in the back of his barber shop for the accommodations of the public, both hot and cold water. This was in 1909. In 1909, we saw the first ad for a automobile, the Fuller car. And we're told that the first one sold was to Peter Zerker, who lived just outside of town. And this is a photograph of about that same time of Mr. Zerker's sons showing off that car. The Whitewater Garage is announcing that they have an up-to-date garage located in the Cheney building. Will keep and have for sale the Fuller, Gleason, and Rio automobiles with cushion and pneumatic tires. So tires that went flat started pretty early. But they're also advertising an auto livery. This is one of those transitions, evolutions that I mentioned at the front of the presentation, where a livery stable for horses was literally remodeled to become an auto livery location. So the guys that rode into town on horse could always leave their horse at the stable while they took care of business in town. And when they came back, the horse was fed and had gotten water and probably curried and ready to go home. And so they were offering the same service with the automobile. And you leave your auto at the livery. And when you come back for it in a week or 2 weeks, or whenever you're ready for another road trip, the car would be fueled up, the oil was checked, the tires were aired up, the car had been washed, and it was ready to go. So it's just unique to think about this evolution from horse to automobile. And the question that went on for many years, why raise mules while gasoline engines can be bought for less money? And there's arguments going both ways. An engine doesn't eat all winter long, but a mule you can usually get a mule started. Surprise your wife by taking home a model kitchen cabinet. And I would think that's better than surprising her with the undertaking service. This is the last block ad, or one that had a drawing or picture for a horse-drawn buggy or wagon. This was in 1913. The automobiles were starting to take over rather quickly. And so family transportation was taken care of. Now, buggies and horse-drawn equipment was sold yet for many years, on up into the 1940s, but it was no longer advertised. Saturday evening, the electric lights were turned on to the house circuit and later to the street lights, so they run until midnight. That may not be a bad idea either. This was in 1913. Now, the phone, you remember the date for the phone? 1890 something. It was already in service, and yet electricity was not in vogue by service line. There were generators prior to this time, but by service line, they were just getting started in 1913. Also in 1913, the last of the Main Street hitching racks was torn out Tuesday. So in 1902, they were begging for more racks. By 1913, they were done with them. The present increase of automobiles keeps up, it says here, there are now 30 cars in town and a few more than that number in the rest of the township. So the cars were taking over. Here's a notice for a mechanic located in the Nyman garage. They've been positioned to give you expert work on your automobile or gas engine, having had 12 years experience as a machinist. What else would a car mechanic or an auto mechanic claim for experience in 1914? He was a machinist, so he had the aptitude. The Leslie Hotel, which was a very fine hotel, is offering a big special Easter dinner for 35 cents. Keep in mind that farm labor pay was $1.85 a day at that time. Here's Mr. Brune advertising a line of John Deere equipment. This was prior to John Deere building a tractor. This was just farm equipment. But at the bottom, we see the first ad for a farm tractor. Mr. Brune was selling the Twin City oil tractor, 15 to 60 horsepower. Athena underwear for women, correctly tailored in every part from the shaped shoulders to the tapered ankles. Fits a woman as though it were part of her. Made in 28 shapes and 38 fabrics. Now there's two things I learned from this ad. I had no idea there were 38 different fabrics. All I could come up with was denim and t-shirt material. And other than that, I couldn't fathom any other fabric. And the other thing, I had no idea there were 28 different shapes of women. This Mrs. Marburger was the wife of a minister in town, and she's offering piano, voice, and violin lessons for $4.50 for over a period of 9 weeks, 1 lesson per week. The photos in advertising actually started in 1911. This was one of the first ones that you could actually make out because they didn't reprint very well in a newspaper. A new bakery just opened, the door east of the bank of Whitewater. That's exactly what I was waiting on. It was time for a donut. Mr. Nolder, who operated a hatchery in town, was the mayor in 1918 when he requested businessmen of Whitewater to place cards in their stores that say, "Speak English, this is America." And then he goes on to say, "I had a right to do this. This is a wartime, or was when I asked this to be done. I did not say that any person could not go into a store and ask for what he wants in German, but want them to talk English when they can. They should not gather 4 or 5 in a crowd and talk German on the street or in the stores, as large numbers of people take exception to this. This is what I wanted to eliminate and thereby keep peace in the city." I'm sure his heart was right and his intention was good. However, it's interesting to note that there was a huge German population that settled all around Whitewater. They were not involved other than the Penners, and a little bit later, the Zerkers, the Mennonite. There were no Mennonite names involved in the commerce of Whitewater. They took care of farming. And they first started settling this area in 1876, long before most of the English people came to town. And yet they were concerned about their neighbors speaking German in groups of 4 or 5. I won't elaborate on any lessons to be learned here. The Illustrated Works of Montgomery Ward and Company, a large paper-covered volume, found its way into numerous homes the first of the week. It is a free publication with lots of bait in it for suckers and smart alecks. We're still saying that today. The suckers and the smart alecks do their shopping online. But catalog shopping started very early. Montgomery Ward's started their catalog in 1872 already. Richard Sears started using print ads that he distributed through the mail in 1888, and their first catalog, their catalog was developed over the next 10 years. We don't know exactly when the first catalog was published. So this is something that's been with us for a long time. And it's amazing what you could get out of a Sears or Ward's catalog. Be diligent in school, and someday you may get to be an educational leader with a salary of $100 a month, while your neighbor's boy, who was idle and neglected all his opportunities, is forgotten until he blows into your town some fine day, rents a vacant building, opens a skating rink, and clears $50,000 in 3 months. I can't imagine any lessons to be learned here either. The Blue Ridge filling station opens up. This was the first dedicated filling station. The cars have been around for quite a few years already and needed gas. Well, the hardware stores and various other stores kept barrels of gas out front where fuel could be pumped, or they might even put in an underground tank with a single pump alongside their store building. But this was the first dedicated. This is the only thing that they sold was gasoline. It was at the corner of Central and Main. For those of you familiar with Whitewater, the building still stands. This business was owned by Walter Zerker and Leonard Claassen. For you Newton folk, the Claassen was a common name. The Claassen Oil, Claassen Lumber, Claassen Flour Mill, and this was all one family. This was a family that seemed intent on building businesses that worked. The Whitewater Rose, self-rising flour, was a staple for many, many years, and they began selling that in 1924. And it was still sold when they were still selling that flour when it was sold to local farmers. Russ, what year was that?
Late 70s.
Late 70s. Correct. This was our time we're talking about now. Frigidaire, the most modern and sanitary freezing machine that can be bought. And now they can sell ice cream and fountain drinks without worrying about the ice getting away from them. The Bank of Whitewater announces the merging of the People's State Bank of Whitewater with the Bank of Whitewater, effective with the closing of business on Saturday, September 8th. There were two banks in Whitewater. The People's State Bank was imagined by many that it went under in the 1920s, like so many businesses did. Perhaps the writing was on the wall. It was the reason for the merger, but they never did go into receivership. It was a merger of the two banks. Here's milk for 30 cents a gallon. The Roth Dairy, they were just on the north edge of town. And you'll notice a phone number here that's different from the 17 or 24 or other 2-digit numbers that were in town inside the city limits. This was the rural phone number, that's 70F11. So the 70 identified the party line. The F was associated with the Whitewater area, and the 11 was the ring designation. So there was a long ring and a short ring. I have a privilege of having a sister in the group here tonight, just to keep me honest. Our phone number when we were growing up was 90F22. So it was the 90 party line, and our ring was 2 longs and 2 shorts. And we were the only ones that were supposed to pick up on that ring.
How'd that work out?
Just like they'd planned, I'm sure. 1942, scrap metal drives was a big thing. And here we have Newman Hardware and Implement with Whitewater getting involved with that. 1948, Whitewater to be sprayed with DDT. And it's kind of an interesting list of instructions here. Cover and put away food in the house. Leave doors and windows open. That one's got me puzzled. Take washing off clothesline. Put your car in the garage and cover beehives. Those were their major concerns. I do not know for how many years that practice continued.
Darryl, does it say what they're trying to kill?
This would have been mosquitoes, I would assume. And flies and 1953, Mr. Stark, who owned the locker plant at that time, started selling appliances, and he was a good salesman. He had the TV on in the front entry of the locker, and over the noon hours, all the businessmen would come and stand in front of that TV to eat their sack lunch. And he sold a lot of TVs. He also installed and serviced what he sold. $430 for a TV that didn't have a real clear picture yet in 1954. And very definitely black and white. Yep.
Have a remote?
It probably did. It was his 6-year-old son. So this was in October of '54. They were advertising the 1955 models. George Reeves had the Ford dealership in Whitewater. Greeno Chevrolet and Resnick had the Chrysler, Plymouth, and Dodge dealership, but with cars that looked like that, no wonder they wanted to advertise. Those were beautiful cars. This is the beginning of 1959. Have you bought your car tag? Do it by February 11th. You can purchase it at the Bank of Whitewater. Seemed a whole lot more convenient than what we have to do now. A new sign appeared, brightened a week by the attractive new neon sign, which was installed in front of Greeno Chevrolet. The sign says Chevrolet and is surrounded by tubes of yellow neon lights. And I know there's some of us that can remember such signs. What beautiful signs, the different colors and those neon tubes were something else. This is 1960, the Stickies Barber and Beauty Salon. There are 2 firsts in this ad. One is it's the first ad for an air-conditioned business. And no doubt that attracted attention for this type of business. It was also the first use of a modern street number. Street numbers did not really come into effect until 1961 in Whitewater, but they were already being used in advertising here towards the end of 1960. In 1962, this was an ad. And that's probably what most everybody thought. Next month, we had this. Are we getting some clues? Quite possibly. And in January of '63, we were introduced to dial telephones. Whitewater Exchange was Turner 3, TU3, and 2111 for the mortuary. This was quite a good ad by Mr. Lamb. In 1963, along with the introduction of the phones, the area code was introduced. So that was the first use of in our area, the 316. Kansas had 2 area codes at that time, 316 for the southern half, and wasn't it 785 for the northern half? Also in '63 was the introduction of the zip code by the post office. So those are 2 numbers that we've had around for that long time already. And with every improvement adopted, we must be willing to compromise or abandon something we will never get back. And this was the case here in 1963, where the Chamber of Commerce had a dinner of honor for those who had been the telephone operators, and honored the women who were still around at that time. Lorena Schroll carried on that service for 43 years. Imagine the stories that she got in on or was able to tell, whether she was supposed to be in on it or not. But what a fantastic service. There were literally lives saved because of the operators. When somebody was calling for help, they knew the neighbor next door and notified them, for instance, or they knew that the person that a party was trying to reach was over visiting Aunt Alice, and could connect them without the calling party even knowing that they weren't being connected to the house phone, etc. Those operators did a terrific job. Community progress and your newspaper go hand in hand. The survival of a good newspaper is impossible in other than a good community. This was in 1965. This is a special notice in September of 1966 that a new telephone number will be introduced to the Bank of Whitewater, as advertised in theirs as SW or SWIFT 9232137. And that number will still work if you want to get hold of the Bank of Whitewater, or what is now known as Vintage Bank. The previous number is still listed at the bottom of the ad. This had to do with direct long distance dialing. Was the change from the TU3 to the SW9. And then in '69, they started putting out notices that all number dialing for Wichita area after July 1970. The number did not change. It was just how it read. So the SW9 became 799, and we didn't really have to change anything other than remembering to use the 79 instead of the SW. '71 was an auction of the Brune blacksmith shop. 2 generations of continuous service in Whitewater since 1889. And again, we lost a terrific service when the Brunes chose to close their business. There was no family to turn it over to, and there was no one interested in trying to maintain such a business. 1973, you could buy an electric typewriter, Smith Corona Electra 120. What a great gift for a graduate. In 1974, Wheat State Manor was opened. And a picture here of the first 2 residents. In 1976, look what you could get for $200. CB radio, my goodness. And in 1979, Towanda and Whitewater papers were sold. The local papers went out of business. The Butler County Times tried to maintain somewhat of a local town newspaper, but it did not have advertising support. It didn't have any notice of who ate Sunday dinner at whose house, and interest was lost in the newspaper, and newspapers were done. So that is a glimpse of Whitewater, 1885 to 1979. Are there any questions? Yes.
Population during those early times here through the
That's a good question. And for the same period of time, we had varying reports on the population.
Sorry, I'm just going to turn off the screen share so that we can see you better. There we go. So that people online can see you bigger.
The peak number of residents was probably around 800, and that would have been in the 1920s, 30s, and then it dwindled down, and currently is somewhere just over that figure. Still less than 1,000, but 900 and some now. Yeah. They were small stores. There was a lot of specializing, and each proprietor had a list of friends that came to see him, and that's what kept them going. But yeah, it's just interesting to note that there were 4 grocery stores. It seems like for that many people, 1 or 2 would have been sufficient.
The McLean name appeared on a lot of those ads. Was that the same family who started the McLean southeast of Newton, that town?
I don't know one way or another. I don't think that it is. Actually don't know who the town of McLean was named after, but the McLeans were the owners of the bank in Brainerd, and then after it moved to Whitewater for just a couple of years before George Nyman purchased the bank.
I thought it was, the prices in all these ads are so much lower, and then you see that, $435 for a TV, you can get a pretty nice TV for $435 today. So it's interesting how TVs have come down so much compared to everything else.
Technology is I don't know, possibly the only thing that has become more efficient in manufacture, and so we can see the reduction in pricing. But you're right, $430 for a TV at that time was a major obligation.
Yeah. Well, and I would say those of you watching online, I've got the Facebook chat up here so I can see that, and then let me just look on your computer here and see if we've had any questions come in from. It looks like, oh, here we go. We did get one come in from Zoom, and those of you watching on Zoom can oh, and Jay Harvey asked if you would please repeat the questions so that everybody can hear. Someone asked, how did Whitewater get its name? That came in from one of our Zoom watchers.
Well, there have been several suggestions over the years as to how Whitewater got its name. The most commonly repeated legend was that an Indian found a white woman floating in the river. And it was called the White Woman River for a time, and then changed just to Whitewater River. And the river that passes right on the western edge of Whitewater is actually a branch and is not the main Whitewater River. That's over just on the west side of Potland is the major line of the major flow of the Whitewater River. Other than that legend, there was nothing repeated often enough to even know what else could be the source of the name of the town.
From a demographic standpoint, I'm really puzzled by that one ad where they had the 4th of July celebration with all these various things. And the one item that stood out to me was the cricket match. Now, with the heavy German population in the area, was there some British immigration that brought knowledge of cricket, or where did that come from?
The question has to do with the mention of a cricket match during the 4th of July celebration. An ad that was posted early in the presentation, and cricket being primarily British in its origin. You know, Ron, I don't know the answer to that. Why that was. Somebody in the area apparently introduced it, and enough to where guys could play it. But
there was that one gentleman's rich people's settlement over in Kingman County of British, where the families would send their young men there where they were supposed to learn how to running meat, yes, running meat. Yeah. So is there anybody from there have gotten into the Whitewater area to introduce cricket?
that's a possibility. How cricket came to Whitewater is is something. Kim, are you ready for a research project?
I wonder if, because it is related, like cricket and baseball, all these stickball sports are having like part of the same family tree of sports, you know. I wonder if the cricket they're talking about is the same rules as what we think of as cricket.
It was suggested that maybe there's been enough rules change in the games that the cricket resembled more our commonly known baseball, and that's a possibility too.
Let's see, see if anybody else had a question on blue, and I'll just look at visual.
Tell us a little bit more about the settlement now that we've kind of raised that issue. A number of the communities here were ethnic communities. Was the railroad the predominant reason for the settlement, or what was the beginning of the Whitewater settlement?
The question has to do with the why the settlement of Whitewater. What was it that got it started? And that's a good question. There was no mining in the area. There was no oil in the area. There was no lumber activities. What was it that caused the town to grow right there? Even the intersection of the railroads wouldn't have required a town. In 1876 is when the Mennonites began settling in the area, and they were agrarian culture for sure, and farming was their thing. Whether or not they were better farmers than anybody else, we don't know. What they did have was a culture, a communication system that independent settlers didn't have. You can be assured that when the minister said you're dismissed on Sunday morning, they stepped outside the building and started talking farming. And they had this constant exchange of ideas and practices. And that's what assisted the Mennonites in becoming so successful. Now, there's no doubt that the Mennonites were excellent stewards of what they had. They were very good at managing what they were able to get, whether it was land or equipment or families. And the Mennonites did an excellent job at that. So that said, in order to explain that perhaps Whitewater was started as a shipping point for these farmers, the grain, the produce, the livestock could be shipped in 4 different directions that other towns didn't have. All other towns that could only go two other directions. So that is the best explanation that I've found. As you might imagine, in the beginning of any kind of an organization, in particular a town, there was a constant juggling of leadership and ideas, the guys changing businesses to see what works best for them or where they might fit in best. And along with that comes some bickering and complaints and carrying on. And we saw that from time to time in the newspapers. And it's a marvel that any town exists those early years, exists past those early years. And Whitewater was successful in doing that. So even though there weren't these other enterprises or occupations like we mentioned earlier with oil or mining or lumber, it was grain farming and livestock, I'm sure, that helped the town get established.
You showed early on the map where you had figured out that originally the railroad was going to go southeast,
Right?
instead it went southwest. Any evidence uncovered on why the change in the location?
Okay, the question is in regard to the rerouting of the Rock Island Railroad after it came down south from where Elbing was established and was thought to go to the southeast through Brainerd and on towards Towanda. Instead, it turned to the southwest and crossed George Nyman's land and on towards Wichita. There was a lot of talk about that, and Mr. Nyman was attacked for buying the railroad and convincing them to come across his land. Well, there had to be a reason for the railroad to make a change. It wasn't just because Mr. Nyman gave him a few dollars. The railroad didn't need that. So what we think happened, and there's a lot of evidence to that, to this, is that Mr. Nyman simply pointed out that if they came across his quarter section of land, they had water in the river. Brainerd has no water. And at that time, a steam engine had to take on water about every 17 to 20 miles. It's 17 miles from Peabody to Whitewater. So it would have been a natural stop to take on water. That concept was reinforced by the fact that the Rock Island put up huge water tanks, overhead water tanks along the west side of the railroad. And they pumped out of the river and they dug wells and pumped out of wells there. There was lots of water for the trains. So I have no doubt that that's the very reason they made that turn in the railroad. Had nothing to do with Mr. Nyman other than him simply saying, you come this way, there's water over here. And that's what you guys are going to need about now.
All right, well, let me look one last time and see if anybody else on Zoom had a question. If not, I think we can. Oh, here we go. Do you see that there? Can you tell me what grocery store Gerhard Claassen purchased around 1945 or 1946? And that's from Teresa Claassen.
Now, I'm going to make a guess here that Gerhard was the father of Pete and Benny and George. So he bought the Lambert store in Elbing and established a general store in Elbing. Later, in 1945 or 46, when Pete came back from his military service, he was able to purchase a Lambert store that was in Whitewater. And he started a grocery store there. So eventually, the son Benny took over the store in Elbing. Son Pete and his brother George had the store in Whitewater. And at least by 1950, George left the Whitewater store and established his own grocery store in the town of Buhler. So it was the Lambert store that was purchased by the Claassens and to establish the grocery stores that they had.
Okay. Well, I think probably better. I realized you brought some books, and some people might want to maybe buy some and get them signed. So I'll wrap up the Q&A. Let's give Darryl a round of applause. Thank you, everybody.